We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes from.
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
All right, welcome to this episode of the Sensible Socialist podcast. I am your host, Kevin Gustafson, and this week we're going to do something a bit different than we've done in the last few weeks, which is that I'm just going to talk a little bit about something that, a little bit about me, why I'm a socialist, where I'm kind of coming from, and what I wanted to do is do that in response to David Pakman's video on why I'm not a socialist. I like David's show. I think that he's pretty informative. He has a lot of good things to say. He puts a lot of good things in, a lot of good perspective. And I think that he was actually right on the money in his video about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Democratic Socialists of America and the difference between social democracy and socialism. And so I think if you need a good background on that, I could give you one, but I think David did a good job. So go over to David's YouTube channel and take a listen. But this video I want to do in response to the video he made after that one, which is why I'm not a socialist. And in that video, he sort of lays some criticisms at the feet of socialism and gives a bit of a background as to why he's a social democrat. So I know the thrust of the video is sort of why he's not a socialist. So I thought that we would kind of use that as a launching point to talk about where I'm coming from and why not only do I disagree with David's sort of criticism of socialism, but where I think social democracy doesn't really cut it. So the way I figure I'll do that is I'll play a little bit of what David had to say, I'll respond, and we'll kind of go back and forth on that. So here's how David starts out talking about why he's not a socialist.
What is democratic socialism versus what is social democracy? And I did a story explaining the difference. Democratic socialism is actually socialism, wants to remove capitalism and replace it with socialized ownership of the means of production, at least originally, although now there are people who say, well, they're still democratic socialists, but they don't actually want that, which makes me question whether they're actually democratic socialists at this point. And then on the other hand, we talked about social democracy, which is a progressive movement that wants to work within a market economy, within capitalism, and make it more of what I call a socially guided market economy. And the difference is massive, and the confusion between these two systems is very, very problematic.
So that's a pretty decent description of the kind of difference between socialism and social democracy. That'll work for the time being. So then David just goes on and explains why he's not a socialist.
Fundamentally, I'm not a socialist because I want an egalitarian, free, self-determining society. And that type of society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus.
So this is a pretty complicated argument already. What he's saying is that he wants a free, self-determining economy, but that won't come out of, or that's the antithesis of an authoritarian regime. I can get on board with that, and that doesn't have anything to do with socialism. The notion that it is inherently authoritarian is not at all some kind of axiomatic point, or it's not a given. So I don't see why we can jump immediately to authoritarian structures. So I would argue that socialism is actually the removal of authoritarian structures, and that what I would call socialism, the worker ownership of the means of production and the direction of that economy from that economic base, would be one that is inherently anti-authoritarian. And so the idea that you can just immediately go to authoritarianism seems to me to be a non sequitur, or at least too much to begin with. But let's let David continue.
Socialist and communist structures are fundamentally authoritarian, and at scale, enacting socialism or communism becomes authoritarian. And
okay, so I don't know why you can make the point that socialism or communism at scale is fundamentally authoritarian. Either it's something like every system at scale has to be fundamentally authoritarian to be put in place and to maintain itself, or that there's something inherent about communist and socialist ideas that have to be authoritarian in terms of the scaling of that model. And so in order to make the case that this is somehow inherent, you'd have to give the example, the prototypical example of a communist system that maybe degenerated into authoritarianism or something like that, or was authoritarian from the beginning. So in some ways, this next part really hinges on what example David decides to use to make this point about the inherent authoritarianism of socialism or communism.
a top example is Venezuela.
Venezuela? Venezuela is a top example of socialism?
Let's assume in good faith that the Chavez-Maduro goal was a truly egalitarian, free, thriving society. I don't know if it was, but let's be charitable, right? And they really did want that as the end goal. When you put aside the populist, collectivist rhetoric of that regime, the Venezuelan regime is an authoritarian imposition of government without all sorts of freedoms, lacking in press freedom, lacking in judicial freedom. It's a long list, and I'm opposed to it. And whatever their intentions were, their imposition of those intentions in this authoritarian way has led to absolute disaster. And some socialists, Leninists, will say that the opposition to the Venezuelan regime is American AstroTurf, or that the replacement to Maduro might be worse. Step back for a second. An authoritarian apparatus will not lead to an egalitarian, self-determining society, period.
Sure. An authoritarian system will not lead to a self-directing free society. I get that. But the Chavez regime was voted in and reaffirmed by elections. So I don't really get that part of it, that it's somehow inherently authoritarianism. It wasn't inherently authoritarian. It was elected. So I don't understand that at all. Also, this is, I think, the perfect place to plant a flag about the difference between the outlook of a sort of a liberal perspective, maybe enlightenment only, for lack of a better term, and a more Marxist perspective. Because in order to understand what happened in Venezuela, you have to understand what the conditions were in the world, in Venezuela, between the United States and Venezuela, and the history of the United States' role in South America and the dynamics of global capitalism. And if you understand that, you understand the relation between the oil crises in terms of pricing. You understand how there was a significant economic war against Venezuela, both from the United States but other people as well. There were mistakes made by the Chavez government that are coming back to bite them in the ass. They do have a situation where they have two really bad options, and they're taking the one that they think is the least bad. And all of these are not simply to be laid at the feet of the inherent authoritarianism of socialism. I mean, that's the weakest argument against socialism that you can make. And David is a smart guy and understands this kind of stuff. So to go to Venezuela just doesn't make sense. And to do it in the way that he did it, by making it the example of the inherent authoritarianism of socialism, it's just a little unfair. And but maybe he's got more, and we'll check it out.
But before we get to all of the conclusions, we need to talk about what we mean when we say socialism or communism. When did it start? What does it actually mean? So for our conversation today, when I talk about socialism, I'm talking about modern socialism and communism in the tradition of the 19th century. And if you go back to our Socialism Has Never Worked Debunked video, we mentioned older societies and sort of collectivist iterations of economic arrangements. But for today, we're talking about modern socialist theory, and that dates back roughly to about the 1800s.
So yeah, I think David actually does a decent job at describing what a little bit of the history and background of socialism. So if it's not too bad, I'm just going to let him keep going.
And there are three main lines of socialist theory. Almost no one who likes to talk about socialism on the internet actually knows about this stuff. This is really important. This is the nuts and bolts. First, you had the utopians in the 19th century. These are people like Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. And their idea was that there would be the development of these collectivist, egalitarian, sort of perfect, as the name utopian implies, societies, sometimes in isolated enclaves, and they would eventually spread. And I actually do believe that individually they can work, but once you say this is the system for the country, it becomes authoritarian in its implementation. Well, you'll develop conflicts between these utopian enclaves.
Yeah, I don't doubt that you'll have conflict between, there'll be differences between groups of people. But the idea that leads inherently to authoritarianism is he just never makes the argument. So I don't understand that.
But as usual, there was some good stuff proposed there, okay? Their theory applied to an individual company or a commune or a village. It's actually a pretty good idea. I've just not seen evidence that utopian theory can apply to a country of 300 million, for example, but I'm willing to have my mind changed.
All right, so let me try to change your mind. The idea that workers can use democratic means to run a business, or even communities can use democratic means to run communities, has some kind of problem at scale in terms of the ability to have democratic structures and to have genuine democratic structures. I don't fundamentally see why that is so difficult to believe that could happen. You can create, and people have spent, as political scientists in particular, have spent a lot of time thinking about how you'd be able to structure systems so that they would be the most democratic they plausibly could be in a situation where you do have large geographic areas that are supposed to be covered, huge internet-connected systems that need to be working together to accomplish certain goals, and how you be able to distribute the power such that there is no single person or group who would be able to consolidate that kind of power such that they'd be able to put in place the authoritarian system that David worries about. Now, just because there are socialists, and we're talking about the idea of owning the means of production and controlling the means of production, thereby instituting democratic institutions in all walks and aspects of our lives, why that needs to be or would inherently lead to authoritarianism. It wouldn't. What it would lead to is a genuine democracy, a democratizing of power, and the ability to have genuine power resting at the base. The ideas of liberalism and American ideas about freedom and equality and liberty, just the way that you would genuinely apply them, which is to descend and to democratize where democracy is. We're talking about a system, capitalism, that has markets, which are fine ways of distributing goods. I don't have a problem with markets. But what I have a problem with is who owns and controls the markets. And in socialism, the workers do. In capitalism, capitalists. And so there's no reason to think, there's no genuinely good reason to think that simply because you're trying to institute democracy at scale, that will somehow inherently be authoritarian. It doesn't follow, it doesn't make sense, and there's every reason to believe that if you actually democratized everything, that you'd have good outcomes, because then everyone has a genuine interest in participating. You want to get the educated people that Dewey and Jefferson and other people who theorized about democracy said we need. You need them to have a vested interest in all aspects of their life, and especially the aspect of their life that gives them the means to live and the raison d'etre. You have to give people ownership and control of their lives. And in the system that we have right now, we might have efficient ways of distributing goods, but we have terrible ways of distributing power and control. And what we mean by socialism, and I think what socialism has really always meant, is that with an economic base of the workers owning and controlling the means of production, you eliminate the class aspect of the society such that you actually enable people to have a freedom of opportunity, an ability to self-direct, freedom in a genuine sense to choose what you'd like to do with your life, not subject to the constraints of what are you going to do to, at fundamental, stay alive.
After the utopians came the anarchists, the sort of second wave, second line of socialists. And the main thing with the anarchists was that government is the problem. They were actually a lot like the more extreme libertarians of today for different reasons than libertarianism. The anarchist socialists saw the government mostly as an apparatus that reinforces the status quo of class divisions, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, or today we could say corporate versus individual interests, or elites versus everybody else. And libertarians, of course, oppose government for different reasons, but there was actually a similarity there. And that also doesn't appeal to me. As most people know, I'm against this on principle. I think that the government does have a role to play. But that being said, the anarchists had some valid critiques. Governments often do become pillars of support for corporate rule. They do reinforce the status quo. They do reinforce power structures. I've seen no evidence that eliminating the government is the solution in the way that the anarcho-socialists or the libertarians believed. Super interesting that even though now libertarians and socialists are mostly diametrically opposed, some of the original strains of socialist thought had a lot in common with libertarianism. They agree. They don't want central government because it's oppressive and tyrannical, but for different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, libertarian everywhere else in the world just means like radical socialist. So it's just another instance of America and Americans sort of taking a word and totally taking it out of the context, using it and distorting its meaning. But that aside, the fundamental idea of communism is that you don't need a state because the state is there to enforce class relations. The anarchist that he was talking about is right. That is the role of the state. Now, the thing is, there's a role of the state in eliminating those class dynamics, but there is no role for the state once there is no class dynamics to maintain. Because, again, going back to the idea of genuine democracy does not demand a government like we think, a state apparatus that is there to ensure that the rules are followed. If the rules are genuinely made democratically, the rules are going to be followed. And even if you have people who don't follow the rules, you have genuine and honest democratic mechanisms to be able to find a just punishment that is able to, or a just redress to the issue that the person who is breaking the rules is able to come up against, and in a way that isn't somehow authoritarian or destructive or something like that. So I think the idea that you need evidence that somehow anarchist systems have worked. I mean, there's no way that you could really do that. This is in some way speculative because we're asking what we could do, not what has happened before. If you asked a slave in 1830 that if they thought that it was possible, or hell, a slave owner, if they thought you were going to have a system where slavery wasn't going to be around, they tell you, I've never seen evidence of that really working. I mean, there's just you could talk to a feudal peasant and tell them, one day you're going to be a worker who will be able to choose where you go to work, at least to some degree, and the peasant will go, I've never seen that be possible. We're talking about what is possible theoretically and practically, and that's where the value of Marxist ideas come into play, because it's where practice meets theory. It's saying, what can we do? How do we understand where things have come from? And what do we do to put the right institutions and right dynamics in place so that we can end a very divisive period of human history, developmental for sure, but very divisive period of human history, the class struggle period of human history, and move beyond it and move to something else. It doesn't demand authoritarianism. It doesn't demand a state. There's a way that you'd be able to do that. So these two old trends, the utopian idea that you just, that you can have co-ops or small communes, you're just talking about doing that writ large. There's no reason why that can't work. And when you're talking about not having a state, if you have these communes with genuine democratic ways of interacting and creating a sort of system of genuine cooperation and participation in a society whose production model is based on need and advancement, not profit, you're talking about a system that would be able not to have a government. So the two problems that David have with socialism comes from a fundamental misunderstanding or from some assumptions that just are going unvoiced. And so if he could say what those assumptions are, it would be really helpful. But let's see where he keeps going with this.
And then after the utopians and after the anarchists, you get to what are now the most common versions of socialism. After utopianism and anarchism came Marxist-Leninism, if we consider it together, or Marxism and then Leninism. They're not actually the same thing. And there, once again, there is stuff of value. If people could realize that many of the critiques made by socialism are actually really good, we'd be much better off. Some of the solutions they propose have only elements of good ideas, and in Marxism, it's the labor theory of value.
Now, David, I'm sure knows that the labor theory of value is not a Marxist idea. The labor theory of value is a classical economic idea. It's Ricardian. It's Adam Smith. These are not. It's not a Marxist idea that value is generated from labor, and the ideas of. It's ideas of surplus value and the relationship from that to exploitation and the problem of accumulation of capital that really is what's interesting about Marx. So I'm not sure it's the labor theory of value that's useful about Marx. It's the other criticisms of capitalism that are based on the use of the labor theory of value. So I'm pretty sure that David knows that, but I think he's maybe just shortcutting here a bit.
Extraordinarily brilliant analysis of how capitalism works, which basically pointed out that you have fixed costs. Like if you're going to make a product, if you're going to make computers, for example, you've got your fixed material costs. You've got the factory, you need to buy the semiconductors, all of that stuff. And then you bring in workers and you pay them something with the idea that they add more than that to the total value, and that's surplus value. You might have in a $100 computer, $50 of parts, and then $50 of added value. If you can pay the worker $30 to add $50 of value, you've created $20 of surplus value. This is a great analysis. This is an absolutely accurate analysis. The problem is I don't believe the ultimate solution to that identification is the end stage of capitalism with a Marxist revolution. That's not what I see as the long-term solution.
No, I really think here it depends on what you mean by Marxist revolution, right? Because if you're talking about some kind of bloody coup, I guess I'm on board that I don't really agree that we would necessarily need to do that. But if you're talking about some kind of change from a capitalist mode of production to a socialist or communist mode of production, why not? I get that you don't think it's the way you should go, but I'm curious why. I mean, it's why you're not a socialist, right? So I know that you're not a socialist, but I don't know why.
So again, utopianism. I don't think it would work at the country level, but for individual companies or communes, I think it's actually a great idea to organize co-ops and shared ownership. Great. That has worked. We can apply it to healthcare. We can apply it to education. I don't see that as the solution to all of society.
Again, I get that you don't think it is, but you haven't given me a reason why you don't think that's something that you can scale.
Anarchism, skeptical of government. Government has become a tool of the elites in many ways. We see it in the United States with Democrats and Republicans using government as a way to maintain the status quo. It's a good critique. I disagree that eliminating government is the solution.
But if I can make the case that the government, as the maintainer of class warfare and dynamics, is inhibiting the free and self-directed society and lives that you want people to have, then shouldn't you agree that getting rid of the government fundamentally, or creating a system that doesn't need a government, is the way that you want to achieve the ultimate goal that you have?
And so what previously had been sort of a cohesive movement, but with different approaches, utopianism, anarchism, Marxism, Leninism. Eventually, what we saw around the time of Lenin was a split between actual socialists and those who went in the direction of social democracy. And I believe that there are a number of reasons why social democracy is the way forward and socialism is not. And in explaining this to you, you'll identify many right-wing arguments against socialism, which I actually don't think are good ones. And this gets to one of my fundamental oppositions to socialism's view of the distributions of outcomes versus social democracies. Socialism in the Marxist, Leninist sort of tradition is simply not aligned with the realities of human distribution, because when we look at human endeavors, they have unequal distribution. If you look at athletic ability and how it's distributed, if you look at linguistic proficiency, if you look at business success, if you look at human height, human weight, it's all distributed on a curve. And on the one hand, where socialism wants to level out the distribution in a way that I've not seen evidence can actually be achieved without significant downsides.
All right. I don't understand the idea that what socialism wants to do is to create inequality of outcome. I hope Jordan Peterson is listening. I hope Sam Harris is listening. I hope a lot of people are listening when I say this. Socialism does not demand the equality of outcome between people. It doesn't fundamentally misunderstand what David's talking about. It takes that into account. It's saying, look, we have to provide genuine equality of opportunity. And capitalism doesn't do that. It never has done that, and it doesn't have anything built into the system that would allow it or give it any incentive to do it. In order to be able to enact capitalist systems with some kind of equality of opportunity, you would need authoritarianism. That's the problem. The problem is that in order to have inequality of outcome, you have to have, ridiculous kinds of systems that don't work and wouldn't work. The point is that an equality of opportunity has to be a system where a person's labor and the value of that labor is decoupled from their ability to survive, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to get a genuine ability to see what people would do if not forced to do things because of economic imperatives. And so I think the idea that we just want everyone to have everything the same and we want to pay everyone the same and everyone gets the same stuff, no. It's guaranteeing a basic fundamental standard of living, which is a high one, which is to say you should have a nice place to live, you should have good, reliable, efficient ways to get around, you should be able to travel, you should be able to pursue your dreams. Yes, you should have a very, very good life, and we should be able to create a system that supplies that to you. But it doesn't mean that everyone has to be the same. It doesn't mean that people are going to be rewarded the same. It doesn't mean that we're going to force people to be the same. And anyone who's tried to do that under the banner of communism doesn't fundamentally understand what Marxism or communism is about. It's not about leveling the playing field and knocking down the high ones or just bringing everybody down to the bottom. It's bringing everybody up and making everybody free.
What social democracy wants to do is tweak that distribution, lower the absolute top, raise the bottom a little bit, and then reduce the gap between the very bottom and the very top. You're sort of leveling it out. You're raising the mean and reducing the difference between top and bottom.
But if you maintain private ownership of the means of production so that some people are owners and some people are workers, the means by which you're going to level that out and bring that to a middle is inherently authoritarian. You're going to force people to take the money that they've gained from surplus value extraction, which is what the point of capitalism is, and it's one of the main mechanisms of generating wealth under capitalism. If you're going to take that wealth and redistribute it so that you bring the bottom up, the only way that you can do that is by threat of government force. So that's inherently authoritarian.
I think it's important to look at Sweden as an example. The right hates looking at Sweden. Sweden's Social Democratic Party, which I identify with, was built on 5 principles that will sound really familiar to social democrats, to people who follow Bernie Sanders. And those 5 principles were, number 1, an integrative democracy. That means, and we can leave this up, that means that democratic decision making is the standard for legitimacy, period. Real democracy. The people decide the direction.
Except for in the workplace. Now, I know in Sweden there are strong labor unions, and so they have strong labor laws, but that's only because you have strong labor unions. There's nothing about social democracy in particular that says that workplaces should be democratized. It might say that it's good, but if you're going to maintain capitalism, you're not going to have cooperatives as the main source of political or economic power. It's going to be businesses, like it is in Sweden.
Number two, the concept of the people's home, meaning solidarity and equality of treatment as something that everybody is committed to. There's no debate, right? You need that. Number three, socioeconomic equality and economic efficiency are complementary. These are often considered opposing forces by the capitalists, right? The vulture capitalists, which is you can either have an economically efficient society or one that is more equal. The social democratic tradition actually sees those as complementary. Number four, you have a socially controlled market economy. And this is huge. It's still a market economy.
So I really wonder here, like, David is making this link between market economy and capitalism. And I think that it's really important to understand that markets and capitalism go together. Markets are used by capitalism as a means of exchange. It's how you put your goods that you have made in the course of the production model into the hands of consumers. It makes sense. It's a great distribution model. I'm not fundamentally opposed to markets. What I'm opposed to are the way that ownership is done in terms of the production that gets the commodity to the market. And I think that the idea to say there are still markets, it's capitalism, isn't quite right. What we're talking about is a market economy, but you could have market socialism. There's a whole tradition of thinking about market socialism. And so the idea is that markets equal capitalism, I just don't think is fair.
But the economy's direction and the priorities are determined socially. Doesn't mean society owns the means of production, as in socialism, but society guides the market economy.
I would say that it's axiomatic that if you do not own something, you don't have the ability to guide it or control it. In order to have a socially guided economy or markets, you have to have socially owned businesses that participate in a social market. And if you don't talk about that, you're never getting there.
And fifth, proper expansion of the public sector expands freedom and freedom of choice. Think about it. Healthcare for all lets people get the jobs that are actually their passion. Socialized education means that people can really study what they want rather than deciding on the cheapest career to avoid student loans. This is all in line with my ideology, but it still exists within a capitalist market economy that allows for entrepreneurship and individualization and all of the good things that come from the natural diversity of people.
There again is the market capitalist conflation, as well as, I mean, everything there, if you just said it's still capitalism, I would agree is, and I would argue is socialist or communist. That's a society that it's owned and controlled by the people who live in that society using democratic means to be able to decide what should happen and how people should live and decide for themselves how they're going to engage in their lives, then that's socialism, not social democracy, not capitalism.
A totally socialist society, whether Marxist or utopian or anarchist or Leninist in the US, would actually be impossible. But what wouldn't be impossible would be socializing certain elements of American society.
Wait. Why is it impossible? Why can you just make the claim that it wouldn't be possible? So, while X isn't possible, Y is possible. I'm pretty sure that's a bit of a fallacy, David. Like, it just doesn't make sense that you can say, oh, since this doesn't work, we can do the thing that is kind of like it, but not all the way, because all the way doesn't work. But again, why?
Healthcare, for example, very doable. Large countries socialize healthcare.
We should.
Education could be put into sort of the umbrella of social welfare in the United States.
Should be.
That's the social democratic model that I support.
I mean, I want to have this discussion with somebody, but when it comes to reform or revolution, it's a big question in the socialist community. And I think the right way to think about it, Rosa Luxemburg sort of put it this way, is that It's reform to revolution. So I'm in favor of all that kind of stuff. More, universal access to healthcare, all that kind of stuff. But it's not the end. But all right, here's David giving us the summary.
So to sort of give you the highlights of why I'm not a socialist and I am a social democrat, I believe that a socially directed market economy that reduces income inequality and ensures a real standard of living for everybody is more realistic, and it's also more in line with human nature, which it actually shows that there is distribution when it comes to any endeavor that humans get involved in. And I fundamentally, and this gets back to the real reason that I so vehemently oppose what we see going on in Venezuela and what we see and have seen in other places around the world, I do not believe, because I've seen no evidence, that an egalitarian, self-determining, free society will develop from an authoritarian apparatus, period. I'm willing to change my mind, so let me know your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pacman Show. And I look forward to dialogue on this issue going forward.
All right, so I hope I kept that little bit in there because I'm taking a lot of David's audio here, and I don't want to be an asshole about it. But I think this is my sort of way of like trying to start the dialogue or trying to have a dialogue. But again, let's just I'll go briefly because I've already said it a lot. The idea that socialism is inherently authoritarian isn't true. It's a fallacy. It does not represent reality. We can be fair and say there have been instances of places that have used socialist ideas and have been authoritarian and horrible. And there are reasons for that. And if we are to be good Marxists, we have to look at the reasons for that, admit that, and go forward. We can't shy away from the truth. That's not the point of the Marxist point of view. But at the same time, the idea that communism is inherently authoritarian is literally the antithesis of the idea. The idea is a democratic society that doesn't need a government to have authoritarian kinds of ways of enforcing the rules. That the rules are based on democracy, common ownership, cooperation, and fulfilling the needs of human beings so that we can free ourselves to explore the full extent of our humanity. That is what the ideas of socialism. They are not the ideas of death, murder, authoritarianism, or anything like that. And the fundamental irony of what David's arguing is that social democracy depends on authoritarianism. Now, it comes in the form of elected democratic legislatures and stuff like that, but they are making laws that take away people's freedom by taking away their money. And in a capitalist economy, that's authoritarianism. And so I just don't see why there is this disconnect behind the idea that you want to have a society that is represented by common worker and social ownership of the means of production and of social life against the idea that you're going to maintain individual ownership of businesses in order to exploit human labor, to maintain all of the problems of capitalist economics, which he didn't mention at all, except for saying that the critique of capitalism was a good one. But the idea that social democracy would be able to rein in those problems is also, there's no evidence for. So if we're using evidence as the basis of the argument, I will agree that the egalitarian kinds of ideas that were attempted to be instituted by Joseph Stalin or didn't work. They didn't work because of fundamental issues with the idea that he was going with. But there are things about it, as David rightly admitted, and I give him credit for, that there were things that were good about what happened. But the thing is, it doesn't. There's nothing inherent about the ideas that force it to be that way. And the grand irony of not taking the Marxist view of something like the Soviet Union or China is that you don't recognize why they degenerated into what they did, and how that's actually the sort of misapprehension of socialist ideas, where they would be best instituted, how they would be best instituted, and how they would be able to change the world. And so for that, you need a much deeper understanding of Marx, but you don't need that much deeper an understanding of Marx. It's the idea that as history has developed, it's places where the most advanced version of the economic system, which has come up against the most obvious contradictions of the system, should be the one to go forth and change it. It's been the way that history has worked, and when it doesn't go in those places, it fails. Venezuela is not in the vanguard of the world capitalist elite. The United States is. And we need to focus on looking at places in the world that are both ready and ripe for revolution because of their experience of going through capitalism. We don't need some kind of authoritarian system that has democratic features to be able to grind a capitalist system into trying to be egalitarian. What we need is to institute genuine democracy around our economy. So that's my reply to David. I think it would be pretty interesting to have a conversation with him to kind of flesh out the ideas a little bit more. But, you know, he's great at being able to put those points together. I might be less so, to be perfectly honest with you, but I hope that, you know, you kind of found as much of a back and forth as I can sort of do when I don't have a person with me. You're able to get kind of two ideas that bounce back and forth on each other, and to see, I think, a way that you could talk about these ideas. And so yeah, appreciate you checking it out. If you're interested, check out the sensiblesocialist.com, Sensible Social 1. This is the Twitter handle. You can just look up Sensible Socialist, and you'll find us. If you want, you can contribute to Patreon. You don't have to. It's not a big deal. I do this for you people. So until next time, take it easy. Check it out, sensiblesocialist.com.